Hello and welcome to the first of 3 bite-sized webinars through which we will explore adaptive systems planning. How often do our plans and strategies get signed off at a point in time and then sit gathering dust on the shelf? Most regulatory cycles propagate the need for a 5 to 10 year business plan, creating regulatory obligations and targets that need to be delivered, come what may, often regardless of a changing context. If the last few years have taught us anything, it is to expect the unexpected. Our plans need to be adaptable. My name is Stephen Herndelhofer and I've spent the best part of 30 years working across the nuclear and water sectors, most recently working in the fascinating area of decision science and complex systems modelling. Over the course of the 3 webinars, I will be joined by my colleague Craig Malshagen, and between us we will explore and hopefully bring to life what we mean by adaptive systems planning and why we think organisations, and particularly organisations that own, operate and maintain complex systems of connected assets, really do need to develop such a capability. So we've structured the 3 sessions as follows. Today, we're going to focus on the key drivers for building such a capability and also what are the advances in technology and that now make such a capability possible. In the second webinar, we will cover the key characteristics of adaptive systems planning and also how our clients have gone about building such a capability within their own organisations. And finally, in the third webinar, we will share a couple of case studies that bring this all to life and really focus in on the benefits. So before we get into adaptive systems planning, let's first take a look at the context that we all operate in now as a key driver to change. So today, we're all coming to terms with a pace of change that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Change that affects all aspects of our professional and private lives. Management theorists are starting to refer to this dynamic context as VUCA. At a basic level, it is simply an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It was coined by the American military to describe the political environment during the Cold War and later adopted by management theorists to represent the changing and dynamic context that we all have to make some sense of. According to the theory, making sense of VUCA largely centres on our ability to think in a systemic way. This is at odds with our natural approach, which is to break up complex problems, create structure and linearity. In effect, adopting a systematic approach to complex problems. But in the process, we often create bias and siloed thinking. Indeed, many organisations still promote and incentivise individual and functional performance ahead of team, process and systemic performance. This traditional approach is endemic in not only how we think, but how we structure ourselves, our teams and our processes. Not surprising then that we find it difficult to approach problems in an alternative way. But change we must. If we are to tackle some of our most difficult challenges, one way of forcing that change is to embed the principles of systems thinking into the tools we use to support our decision making. So what are the principles of systems thinking? Well, it's about understanding the bigger picture. Rather than considering events or components, problems should be framed as patterns, and importantly, problems should be understood within their context. Problem structure needs definition with regards to both the system components and the interrelationships. Feedback and feed-forward loops and their lags require definition. Cause and effect relationships need to be captured and understood. We require an appreciation of how operational policies, incentives and penalties drive behaviour. Assumptions need to be identified, made explicit and tested. These are often inherent to the problem. How would changing assumptions affect the outcomes? In particular, the sensitivity of the decision outcomes need to be fully explored both in the short, the medium and the longer term, depending on, of course, on the nature of the problem that we are exploring. Aspects of the problem that are volatile, uncertain, complex or ambiguous from one viewpoint may not be from another. The perspectives of different stakeholders therefore need to be considered to identify broader causes and relationships. We must appreciate that mental models and mindsets define current realities and expected futures. The attitudes and expectations we all use to understand the world create filters for problems and their solutions. Inherent bias is always an issue, often exacerbated by organisational structure and dynamics which breed groupthink, received wisdom, and tribal allegiances. We must resist the urge to jump to conclusions. Outcomes from systemic evaluations are often surprising and not necessarily intuitive. It does not mean that they are wrong. Of course, to remain credible, we need to be able to explain our conclusions and recommendations. And to do this, we must ensure that all relationships, assumptions, and perspectives are reasonable. Further tests and experiments to build confidence in the outcomes might be required to stress test and confirm outcomes and the way forward. Summary, this is all about moving from systematic to systemic. Standard project management methods are systematic, with the origin of solutions developed through the decomposition of the problem, not generally considering it as a whole. Taking a bottom-up, disaggregated approach creates new constraints and precludes more radical, holistic solutions, for example, where you might consider the fundamental redesign, reconfiguration, or repurposing of your asset systems. A more systemic approach not only considers the component assets within the system, but also their structure, the interactions between those components, as well as the environment in which they operate. It complements top-down thinking and views emergent VUCA behaviours as inherent to many types of problem. So what is adaptive systems planning? Well, it's a headline level and it's about embracing the principles of systems thinking. It's all about moving from structured and systematic planning approach to a more systemic planning approach and embedding that approach in the technology and methodology that we use to make decisions. Within a rapidly changing context, we need to be able to refresh our plans at pace, whether those plans are near-term or strategic. As well as being complex, our challenges are often volatile, changing in the moment. For example, the sudden loss of a critical asset, or as we have seen recently with panic buying of petrol and supply chain constraints around lorry drivers. The ability to quickly change our plans, course correct, adapt to changing circumstances is an essential capability. In a strategic context, the further out we look, the more uncertainty grows. Just take the variability of climate change projections as an example. And also, because we need to consider changing circumstances and a myriad of possible futures, it is critically important that we are able to explore a very broad range of scenarios. Of course, the future is uncertain, but also we do not possess all of the facts. There is bias, opinion, and ambiguity out there as well. So whilst we need to be data-driven, we also need to recognise, understand, and explore assumptions that underpin our planning processes. So adaptive systems planning is all about the planning capability and not just about the plans. Of course, our plans must be representative of the complex systems they represent, but they must also be dynamic to reflect changing circumstances, responsive to sudden, unpredicted change, and nested across multiple time horizons. And to do all of these things and do them at pace, our planning processes and capability needs to be technology enabled, data driven, and underpinned by an intuitive, rapid and bulk scenario planning capability. A capability that provides a more iterative, dynamic and effective planning process for complex systems within an increasingly dynamic and uncertain environment. Our plans need to be repeatable, such that we're able to consider new circumstances and new future scenarios quickly, but in a consistent and managed way. So, the technology we employ for this purpose is fundamentally different to some of the more traditional asset decision-making tools out there on the market, which are largely deployed to support established risk-based methodologies. Whilst these established tools have their place, they are largely reliant on disaggregating the problem and a portfolio approach. Let me explain why. Most portfolio solutions employ a common currency to consider the overall value of interventions against a value framework, such as a six capitals approach. Investments and interventions are generally considered against the future needs of the customers and based on the current and future asset health of individual assets used to deliver that service. The relationship between assets, how those assets connect and combine to deliver service to customers, are not generally considered. Investments and interventions creating the greatest individual value will be selected within the overall budgetary constraints of the programme and any local constraints relevant to the specific solutions. In this context, the asset configuration is largely viewed as static. Of course it isn't. It grows, shrinks and morphs over time, creating constraints and headroom in the process. Not considering the system configuration is a critical gap in this approach. Why does this matter? Well, for starters, you might not even need the solutions that are being selected because a reconfiguration of the system might make certain existing or proposed assets redundant. Also, and what often happens is that the benefits from related solutions are treated as if they operate in isolation and simply accrued and are therefore often duplicated, with siloed solutions laying claim to the same benefits. So when using tools which are taking a more systemic approach, the relationship between existing assets and proposed interventions are considered. This is often fundamentally change. This will often fundamentally change the composition of the investment program. For example, system configuration changes might remove the need for an expensive investment in production capacity by exploiting headroom or removing constraints in the system. Teams are therefore selected on the basis of their overall value contribution to the system, fully recognising interdependence and the relationship of that solution with other candidate solutions, the current system and also other potential future system configurations, i.e. it considers a dynamic system configuration. In some instances, even schemes with a negative individual benefit might be selected because they enable positive net benefit from other schemes or alternative system configurations. In this way, the system itself is optimized, made more fit for purpose and more resilient, delivering a program that is often cheaper and provides greater overall benefit by reducing constraints, exploiting existing headroom, and exposing what would otherwise be hidden value. So I appreciate that this is a notional example I'm trying to use, and I'm trying to use this to convey the concepts and the fundamentals of what is a new and innovative approach. But it's useful to use a real example to reinforce the points that I've made. So Sydney Water deliver water to over 5 million people in the Greater Sydney and Illawarra regions. Not dissimilar to many water companies, their challenges are centred on affordability. There's the challenge to maintain customer prices, population growth, a deteriorating asset base, asset capacity constraints, and pressure on service levels. We were tasked with delivering a 30-year investment programme which delivered all service and environmental obligations whilst maintaining flat customer bills. Their starting point was an unoptimised baseline plan at an estimated cost of 43 billion Australian dollars. Taking a whole system approach, enabling a dynamic asset configuration, we were able to strip 17 billion Australian dollars out of the plan. Our traditional risk-based approach yielded a further $1 billion reduction. And iterating between these methodologies, running multiple scenarios, we were able to offer back a further 6 billion Australian dollars in enhancement investment opportunities. Provided Sydney Water with a new plan which delivered significant additional benefit for $11 billion less, whilst hitting the original objective of keeping a flat bill profile. This is what a senior leader with accountability for strategic asset planning at Sydney Water had to say about the outcome. Our new strategic planning and modelling capability, developed with the support of BMA, has helped us adapt a whole city, whole system methodology. This more strategic approach has been critical to the development and assurance of a more comprehensive, integrated, efficient and affordable 30-year Greater Sydney Water Strategic Investment Plan, which we are now transitioning into delivery. We are confident that the plan will deliver great outcomes for customers and the environment. And whether we like it or not, within a regulatory context, expectations are growing. In a recent assessment of asset management maturity across the UK water sector, the UK water regulator, Ofwat, highlighted a number of areas where it expected UK water companies to improve, many of which spoke directly to the development of this capability. Specifically, and these are direct quotes from the report, aligning and linking decision-making processes across different timeframes, the ability to quantify risks, again across different timeframes, improved management of uncertainty, specifically challenging scenario and adaptive planning capabilities, identifying sensitivity analysis as a critical approach to maintaining uncertainty, and in general, taking a more systemic approach to asset health and resilience planning. As I said, these are all verbatim quotes from this report, as the benefit of building an adaptive systems planning capability is demonstrated through case studies like Sydney Water, and we will go on to share more case studies in future sessions. Relying on traditional methods simply won't cut the mustard. So in conclusion, when dealing with complex, interconnected challenges that we face today, it is our contention that the planning process itself needs to be radically improved. But to do that, the use of technology that embraces the principles of systems thinking is required. Building static plans for complex systems that often take months and sometimes years is no longer acceptable. We need to find ways to embrace the complexity of the asset systems that we are making plans for and be able to consider and repeatedly reconsider the impact of a changing and uncertain context. We need to recognise that the asset system themselves are not static entities, affected as they are by planned and unplanned maintenance, growth and changing demand patterns. And therefore, if our asset systems need to both be dynamic and responsive to change, so must our plans. The decisions we make today will have far-reaching implications for the sustainability and resilience of tomorrow's services to customers and the health of the environment that we all enjoy. We need to be able to think ahead and both conceive and consider many different scenarios in a way which reflects our VUCA context and embraces the principles of a more systemic approach. To close with a chess analogy, every move we make changes the pattern of the game. But would you put your money on the player that only thinks one move ahead? or one who considers the billions of outcomes that are possible by just thinking 5 moves ahead. The human brain simply cannot consider these possibilities, and we need to consider all of the possibilities. We need to change the game. Advances in integrated systemic modelling and the power of cloud computing mean that organisations today are not only able to employ these tools to create such capabilities within their organisations, which at a strategic level are being used to redefine some of the UK's most significant asset management decisions. At the other end of the spectrum, at an operational level, they are driving process optimization and also being used to manage the systemic response to significant unplanned asset outages. In the next couple of webinars within the series, we'll look at how organizations are creating these capabilities and look at a couple of case studies. I really hope that this session has been informative for you. So I'll leave you with a quote from William Arthur Ward, and I hope you're able to join us for the second session in the series, which I believe is planned for the 15th of November. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening.